Welcome to DonzyTech. In this tutorial, I'm going to look at how to get started with Django. Now, this video is going to be very beginner friendly. We are going to go through the installation process, how to set up a Django project, how to set up a Django app, and I'm going to talk about URLs, templates, models, and then migrations. So at the latter part of this video, we are going to talk about the Django REST framework. And then we talk about the two types of views we have in Django. That's using the class-based views or the function-based views. So without wasting much time, let's get right into it. So before we start with Django, we need to understand how or what we even mean by the Django web framework. So Django is just a Python web framework that we use for developing web applications very fast. So fast, I mean, because Django handles most of the security, or let's say the applications you will need to get started with. So example, your Django admin app, your session app, all of these are already handled by the Django. So mostly you are going to hear something we call batteries included. So you have a Django admin already created for you when you create a new project. You have an authentication system already done for you. So user authentication, user login, user logging out, changing of account password, resetting password, all of these are already handled in Django for you. And then we have the Django's ORM, which is very good. So you can directly write classes in creating your tables. So behind the scenes, they are going to be converted into a relational database. So you can choose to go with, let's say, MySQL or PostgreSQL, depending on what you want to work on. Now, the next thing is the Django's architecture pattern. So we have something we call the MVT software architecture pattern, and this is what Django goes by. Now, model is just your database. Your view is just the logic, or let me say the controller or the business logic for your entire application. Whereas the template is what is being rendered in the browser for users to see. Now we have some existing companies that make use of this Django framework. So we have Instagram, we have Spotify, we have Pinterest, and then we have a lot of them which still leverage on Django for some part of their applications. So next we will look at how to install Django. Now to install Django, you first need to have Python installed on your machine. So to install Python, that's very easy. Just visit their official website. That's python.org/download. So this takes you straight to the download page for you to have the Python downloaded. Now we need to install Python because Django is a Python framework. So if you are from a JavaScript background, you notice that mostly in installing any JavaScript library, you need to have Node.js installed because you need the npm, that's the Node package manager, for installing your JavaScript libraries. So same for Python, we use the pip. Now you get the pip anytime you install Python on your machine, and then this is very important. So make sure to add Python to path when you are installing your Python, and then you can verify the version of the Python you installed directly in your terminal. So just type Python space -- version. Now this will just check the version of Python you have installed, and mostly if you have Python installed, it's going to give you the version you have on your machine. In the same way, you can check for the pip version you have installed on your machine. Now, another important aspect in creating a Django project is something we call a virtual environment. Now, why we use virtual environment is to make sure that packages we are using in our project do not conflict with other ones. So there are some times if you are working on a project, you might need a specific version of a particular library. Now, if we don't have a virtual environment, mostly it's difficult to install the packages. So you have to uninstall the old one or the new one to get the specific version you want. But then with a virtual environment, you can now have a different space where all the packages you are using for that particular project will be installed in. So the only thing you need to do is to just activate the environment anytime you want to use it. Now in creating virtual environment, we have some Python packages you can use in creating them, or you can simply use python -m venv and then the name of the virtual environment you want to create. Now the last venv is just the name of the environment, which can be any other thing. So you can call it env, my env, project env, any other thing you prefer. But the most important part is the python -m venv. That's a Python command for creating a virtual environment. Now, if you're on a Mac OS, you would want to add Python 3. But if you're on Windows, you can just go with Python. So Mac OS or Linux systems, you need to just add Python 3 to it, unless you have an environment activated. That's the only instance you don't need to add a 3 to it. All right. Now, the next part we'll look at is how we can activate this environment. Now, to activate a virtual environment on Windows, you just have to navigate to the folder name you created. So for instance, here, if you use env, the reference should be env, not venv. Now, inside the env folder or the environment you created name, we have another folder in there called scripts. Now, inside the script folder, there's a Windows batch file called activate. So here we just use a / to reference that Windows batch file. So when you type this in your terminal and then hit enter, it's going to activate the environment for you. And then if you are on Mac OS or Linux based systems, you are going to use this command source and then the name of the environment you created /bin /activate. So this is how we activate virtual environment on these two operating systems. Windows, you go this approach. Mac OS or Linux, you go this approach. Now, when you have this environment enabled, or let me say activated, the next thing you have to look at is how you install your packages. Now, to install a Python package, we use this command pip install and then the name of the package you want to install. So first, we just have to install Django. So you do pip install Django. So this is going to use or require you to have an internet connection, because it's going to download the packages and then install them in the environment you created. Now, the good thing about Django is that anytime you install a library or a package, the next time you want to use that particular library, you don't need to have internet connection. So we are going to look at this later in the video, unlike the JavaScript frameworks where you always need internet connection in creating new project. But for Django, you don't need to do that. So following the same procedure, you can install any other Python library depending on what you are working. But the key thing is pip install and then the name of the package you want to install. Anytime the package name you entered is wrong, it's going to give you an error, or let me say a warning in your terminal. So you can always look this up on the internet to get the right package to install. All right. So the next part, we are going to look at how to start, or let's say create a Django project. Now, to create a Django project, the first you need to do is to just have the Django installed, as we have done in the previous slide. And then you open your terminal. Now, when you open your terminal, you type this command Django-admin start project. So start project is just one word, and then the name of the project you want to create. Now, after creating the project, you now cd into the project. So what I mean by cd into the project is changing directory to the project folder. So if I type cd my project, it means that I want to open or access my project folder directly in my terminal. Now, the next part we'll look at is to running our Django server. So we use this command python, and then there's a manage.py file inside the project folder. So at the later part of the video, or in the next slide, we are going to look at the file structure, or let's say the folder structure of a Django project. So we use Python, then we call this Python file manage.py, and then we say run server. Now this is going to spin up a development server for you. So just like we work with our normal HTML, CSS, JavaScript, where we click live server in our VS Code, and then you open some kind of address and port in our browser for us to serve or view our project locally. So in the same way, Django has this local development server. So anytime you run this command, it's going to give you an address like this. So mostly you can use the IP address, or you can just type localhost and then bring the port number. This is going to open the default, or let's say the welcome page for your Django project. Now, the next part we'll look at is an app. So we are going to talk about apps later in the next slide. So we just use this command, python manage.py start app, and then the name of the app you want to create. Now, apps are, let's say, a modular component inside a project. So you can think of an app this way. So assuming you are building a system for, let's say, a school, or let's say a school management system. Now, school management systems will contain more than one component. So we can have one for the courses, we can have one for the staff, you can have one for, let's say, finance, depending on the various departments they have in that particular institution. Now, each institution or each department is going to be managed by an app. So this makes sure that you have different components coming together to form an entire system. So all these apps you create would have to sit inside a project. So the project is like, let's say, the mother of your entire system, and then within the mother you can have children. Now the children here becomes the apps you have created. So my app is just a name which could just represent the name of the app you are creating. All right, so below here I have some useful commands you can just check through, but later I'm going to share this video in the description below. All right, so let's look at the folder structure for a Django project. So when you create a new Django project, you are going to have this name, my project. So this is the root of your project. So inside the root of your project, you are going to have your project, you are going to have your apps. If you have more than one apps, they are all going to be listed here. You are going to see the manage.py file and then requirement.txt file, but this one is mostly not the case. So when you create a Django project, you are not going to see the requirement.txt file there unless you run the pip freeze command to just get all the packages you are using for your project. Now let me talk about the requirement.txt file before I even proceed with the folder structure. Now remember, we created a virtual environment. So the work of this virtual environment is to just keep all the packages we are using for our project. So when you are done developing your project and then you want to push it online, or maybe give it to another developer to deploy for you, the developer will need to know the libraries, or let's say the packages you use in building your project. So that's the work of the requirement.txt file. It just keeps a list of all the packages you used in your project. So the developer can just run a simple command to install all the packages and then get the project running. Now when you move to a Django project folder, you are going to see your init that initializes the component, or sorry, the module. And then we have the settings.py file that's used for doing styling for your, the settings for your Django project. So any settings you want to do in your project, we use the settings.py file to do that. We are going to create a project where you are going to see all these things. So inside the settings.py file, you are going to have your database configurations, the apps you are using for your project, the static files you are using, their path, your allowed host, your secret key, and then a lot, setting up your media files and the rest. We are going to do all of that in the settings.py file. The next we have is our urls.py. Now any project you are going to create will come with a default, or let me say the main urls.py file. Now this file is just used for routing in your application. So think of routing as this way. You can visit, let's say, an e-commerce platform. You can click on, let's say, product, it takes you to a page called product. You can click on cart, it takes you to a page called cart. Now all this is done using the urls.py file. So every project you create comes with the urls.py file. That's default. And then we have the WHDI, and then we have the ASGI, which you don't need to worry for now. Now we'll move on to what we mean by an app. Like I explained earlier, apps sit inside a project. So anytime you create an app, you need to register, or let's say add it to your installed apps, which we are going to look at later in this video. Inside an app, there's a folder called migrations. So I named this DB migrations. Now the work of this migrations folder is to just keep track of all the changes you have done to a particular table. All the tables you have created are going to be recorded by the migrations folder. So we have a command that will run, that's make migrations and then migrate. So the work of the make migrations command is to just prep the changes you have done to be applied. So the migrate command will just apply all the migrations that has been recorded so far. So anytime you delete anything from your table, anytime you add a new row, a new column to your table, you have to make sure that you make migration so that the changes can be applied for you. If you refuse to make migrations, your Django is still going to give you a warning that you have some migrations you haven't done, which might affect the performance, or some parts of your project might not work. So we are going to see all these messages shortly. So same thing, we have the init.py where we'll just initialize the my app folder as a module. All right. Now this file would be empty, where you will just need it for doing some basic initialization, but you don't need to worry about this file for now. You can just leave it empty, but just don't delete it. Now we have the admin.py, which just manages your Django admin interface. So any time you create a new model and then you want it to appear on your Django admin interface, you will need to register that particular model inside your admin.py. So basically it does the configurations for your admin panel. You can take it this way. And then we have the apps.py, which also does the same thing, the configuration for your app. And then we have the main file, which you'll be working with mostly. That's the models.py file. So the models.py file is where you define your database tables. So here we don't need to write any SQL to do this. You can just simply write a Python class, and then it will be translated to an SQL database for you. Let's say a relational database for you. So you don't need to have any knowledge of SQL. The only thing you need to understand is how classes, or let's say object-oriented programming work, and then you should just be fine. And then we have the serializers.py. Now if you create a Django app, you are not going to see serializers. I just added this here because if you are already a Django developer working with the REST framework, you might be familiar with this file, the serializers.py. Mostly we keep these files inside the app, but it's not part of the default files created by a Django app. So now we use this if you are working with APIs where you have some models you want to serialize. That's where we use the serializers.py. Now we have urls.py. Now this file is also not in an app by default, but we just create this file and then write all the URLs for the app here inside this file. Now the only thing we have to do is that we tell Django to include the URLs file we have created here inside the project's main URL. Now why we do this is that because we want to build in a modular approach, that's why we always create a urls.py file, so that all the URL configurations for that particular app would be written in that app. So in case you have to send the app to a different developer, you don't need to copy the entire URLs you have in your project to that particular developer. So it makes your project more modular. And then we have the views.py. That's what does the entire business logic for your application. Request, response, everything is being done in the views.py file. That's where you write most of your Django codes. All right, so the last file we have here is the manage.py file. So this is the entry point for your command line interface. So anytime you want to run any command for your Django project, you're going to use this manage.py file. So making migrations, running your server, creating super user, like basically anything you are doing about your Django project, you are going to need the manage.py file to do that. All right. So let's look at this analogy. Okay. So here we have a project and then we have an app. So like I explained earlier on, an app sits inside a project. A project manages all installed apps. So the app is like, let's say, a part of a project, where the project itself is like a container, like I explained, that's like a mother. And then the apps you are creating will just be like the children of that particular mother. So you can think of a project as a container which contains apps. All right, so next we are just going to look at sample codes we have for Django, right? All right, so URLs and then URL routing. Now, like I said, every Django project is going to have a default urls.py file. Now, this is how it looks by default. Okay, so by default, it doesn't have this, and then it doesn't have this. All right, so let me explain this. When we create a Django project, we can choose to write all the URLs inside the project urls.py file. The only thing we need to do is to just import the views into this file. But then if we want to build modular, it means that every app should have its own urls.py file. So that's why we create a new file, urls.py, inside our apps. Now, if we do this, we will need to let Django know where to look for the URLs we have in our app. So to do this, we just import this include function. Now, when you import the include function, you can just create a new path, and then you tell Django to include all the URLs you have inside that particular app. In this case, the my app is just the name of the app you created. All right, so same applies to this one. Now, if we look at the path, this is empty string. So this one simply means that your home page, you don't need to enter any path to access it. So let's say if your website is kofi.com, we can just type kofi.com. But then if I want to access the about page, I'll have to do kofi.com/about. If I want to access a single or a particular item in Django, we can choose to use the primary key, or let's say the ID of the item. We can choose to use the slug. We can also choose to use the UUID. So there are so many ways you would want, or there are so many ways you can achieve this. All right, so depending on the project you are working on. So for instance, you are working on an e-commerce project, or let's say a blog application. Normally you would want to go with the slug, because the slug kind of converts the title you have for a particular post into a hyphenated format or in lowercase. So mostly this one helps in search engine optimization. And then we have using the ID. Okay, so let's say a post can have an ID of 40, an ID of 10, ID of 1, depending on the time you created that particular object. So this also works fine. But the downside of using this is that if you delete that particular post, the post with ID 42, and then you are using this kind of URL pattern parameters, it means that anytime this object is not there, it's difficult to get a post to have an ID of 42. So mostly, or in most applications now, we go with the slug. Okay, so you can have a post with a title, let's say my post. Now the my post is what will be used as the path for that particular post. So in case you delete that post and then you create a new one with the same title, the URL still remains. You don't get that 404 error. So some will just use string and then slug, some will just use slug and slug. Now another thing is using the UUID. So in your Django models, you can specify that all your models should have UUID. So it depends on you. So UUID is just like a long kind of characters, unlike the ID, which is just a single character. So for like users profile page, or let's say pages that contains sensitive information, you can just use the UUID instead of the slug. Now we have named URL reversing. Now named URL reversing, we use the name we specified in path. Now if you check the path function, we have the root or the route, we have the views, or let's say the controller for that particular path, and then we have something we call name. So name is what we use for doing the redirections. So if a user signs up or do anything in your application, you want to redirect them to a new page, we use what we have in the name. So I can say return redirect home, return redirect about, or we can choose to use the reverse. Anyone we want to do, depends our choice. Okay, so you can use the redirect or you can use the reverse. Any of these work fine. All right, so now let's look at function-based views, and then we'll look at the class-based views. Now for function-based views, we use our normal functions we know in Python. So the def keyword, the function name, the parameter is just the same logic, nothing changes. So that's why mostly we say using the function-based views is simple and then easy to understand as a beginner. You don't need to understand some of the built-in, or let's say the default classes. With the normal way we write our functions in normal Python codes, the same way we are going to write functions in a Django project. Okay. Now you can write your own custom logic. That's an advantage because it's not already created. So you have like full control. But then there could be an issue. So you can repeat the same code. So that one will depend on how you are writing the code. But this likely to happen. And then it can also be less reusable as compared to the class-based views. Okay. Now there's an example. So with the function-based views, we can use some decorators. So login required, permission required, require post, require get, CSRF exempt, all these things we can use in the function-based view. So we just use the decorators. All right, now let's look at the class-based view. So the class-based views is like they have already created the things for you. So the only thing you need is to understand how it works. Now this is where it becomes challenging as a beginner, because you need to understand what we mean by the list view, how it works, detail view, how it works, create view, how it works, update view, how it works, delete view, how it works. So there are a lot of them, but this is just the basic one for doing CRUD operations. But then if you are working with the function-based views, you are creating them, you are writing the logic, so you know how it works. So mostly we say it is simple and then easy to understand as compared to the class-based views. But we can choose any approach, it's fine. All right, so I'm going to leave this for you, the function-based views versus the class-based views, which one to use. So I'm going to leave this for you. It will just be a way of learning more about the Django. All right, so now we're going to look at models and then the Django ORM. So like I said before, working with Django, you don't need to use any SQL or have any idea of SQL. Basic understanding of how classes, or let's say object-oriented programming works, you should be able to create a Django project. So as time goes on, you will now get to understand and appreciate relational database if you choose to move into SQL. All right, so this is just an example. We have the class, which is the same normal class we used to write in Python. And so class post, this is just the name of the class you want to create. Now in creating a class like we know in Python, which is not a rule, but let's say a convention, all class names are supposed to begin with a capital letter. All right, and then this will inherit from the model class, which is inside the models module. All right, so you just have to understand how inheritance work in Python. So once you get this, it's the same procedure, or let's say the same logic you are going to apply. Now we can specify that a class post should have a title. So this simply means that every post object we are going to create should have a title. Every post object should have a slug, a content, image, author, category, created at, updated at, and then is published. Okay, so this is just like the way we create normal class, but here we don't use the init constructor. Okay, we just use this approach because we are inheriting from the models file. And then in writing queries, we don't need to write any select or from select where this is. But with Python, we just use, or with Django, we just use the built-in functions they have created for us. So I can say post.object.all. This simply means that I want all the objects that were created from this particular post. Now I can get a particular object by using the ID. So let's say, or let's assume we had a UUID here. We can also get using the UUID. We can also get a particular object by using the slug name. Anyone works fine. If you want to do filters, if you want to exclude, if you want to order, we can directly do this inside Python. We don't need to use any SQL. So mostly we say Django is very easy to understand if you have the basics of Python at your fingertips. All right, but then there are a few things you have to note. So we have something called char field, that's like character field. So this like input field in your normal HTML. So we have the integer, we have the boolean, we have image field, and then we have file field. So if you use image, simply means that you want users to upload only images. And then we have the file field. So the user can choose to upload a file, a document, anything. The user can just upload. And then we have the many to many, which you don't need to worry about now. Text field is like text area. And then we have float, and then we have the decimal. So you can choose to use float field or decimal field. And then we have date time. That's if you want to capture date and then time. And then we have foreign key, and then we have one-to-one field. So these you can later look at them, but for a start, we are going to look at how to just create basic class and then try your hands on the Django before you can move into these ones. Now we are going to look at what we mean by migrations and then DB schema management. So now anytime you make changes to your models.py file, you run this command make migrations. So here python manage.py make migration. So what the make migrations command will do is to detect, or let's say prep all the models you have changed, or let's say all the tables you have changed. Now we have the next command called migrate. So anytime you make migration, it will just create a new Python file for you. And if you run the migrate command, it's going to apply the file that has not been migrated yet. So anytime you make migrations without doing the migrate, Django will just give you a warning that you have some unapplied migrations. So the migrate command just applies all the migrations you have done, and this will just update the database with the changes you did. So whether you added a new column, deleted, or do anything, it's just going to keep those for you. All right, now like I said, we will be looking at the Django REST framework. So assuming you want to build an application where Django would only be your backend, or let's say your server side, I mean. So in this scenario, it means that you are going to need a front-end application, whether a mobile app or let's say a React or Vue or Angular project. Now in this way, Django allows you to create something you call APIs by using the Django REST framework. So anytime you create an API from the Django, you can easily connect this to your front-end application. Right, so here you just have to install the Django REST framework. We install something you call the core headers. So the core headers, because your Django might be running on a different host, and then your front end also might be running on a different host. So the core headers is just a way your two applications or your two hosts can communicate with each other. So all this setup, we are going to look at it separately in the video as we move on. So this is just an example of how we can create an API view in Django. So this is using the function-based views, and then this one is using the class-based views. All right. Now in Django REST framework, we have something you call authentications, and then we have something you call permissions. So authentications, Django allows you to use session authentication. You can use basic authentication. That's where you only need maybe username and password. And then we have the token authentication, and then you can also use the JWT. So you have something you call Django REST framework -simple JWT. So this one allows you to use the JSON web tokens for also doing authentication. Now, if you want to protect some routes, or let's say give permissions to access some specific routes in your application, you can use these classes. Allow any is authenticated as admin user. All these methods or all these classes can be used to restrict access to specific routes in your Django project. And then also remember to add this setup. So depending on what you are using, whether you are using the session or the token, you have to set this up inside your settings.py. But all this we are going to look at later in the video. All right, so the next important thing is our Django admin page. So like I said from the onset, anytime you create a new model, or let's say a new table, and then you want it to appear in your Django admin page, you will need to register that model inside your admin.py file. Now in doing this is very easy. So you just say from the models file, import the two classes you created. So we have post, and let's say we have category. Now you can just run this command or type this command admin.site.register, let's say category. So this is like simple registration. It's going to make it appear on your Django admin interface. So here you can create objects from the category model you just registered. But then if you want to do advanced model registration, where you change how the columns are listed, adding filters, adding search fields, and those things, you can now use the model admin. So you just have to inherit from the model admin, but first you need to create a class. Okay, now in creating the class for your admin page, mostly we follow this convention. You take the name of the model. Let's say the model is post, and then you just add admin to it. So you can say class post admin. So assuming you want to create same for the category, you can just say category admin. Now another good thing about the Django is that it allows you to even add more actions. Let's say some of the actions you want to perform are not inside the default one. You can write custom admin actions that you can use in your Django admin page. So this is just a few of them. Also, we can customize how text appears on the Django admin page. Now if you create a new Django project, on the admin side, you are going to see Django administration. But if you want to change the site header, the title, the index title, you can use this to do that. All right. Now, this is a security tip if you are moving to production. All hackers know that most systems will have something you call admin or management. So it's always advisable to change the default route to something that will be difficult for anyone to predict. And then since you are the super user for that project, you have to make sure you use strong passwords. And then you can also restrict admin to internal IP addresses only. So this one means that you can't access the admin outside. Okay. All right. So with the few we've gone through, we can now say you are ready to start a Django project. So we've gone through the Python installation, Django installation, the project, and then the folder files. We've gone through what we mean by the URLs, the views, and the templates. We've gone through what we mean by the models and the Django ORM, the migrations folder, the function-based views, the class-based views, and then the Django REST framework. So lastly, we looked at the Django admin interface and then how we can customize things for our use. All right, so if you have any questions at this point, you can leave it in the comment section below. So in the next video, we are going to be writing some actual codes, that's creating a Django project and then creating some apps, doing the installation, testing, and then fixing some errors. All right, see you in the next video.